She thought marriage would be a fresh start, a clean slate, a chance to bury the past and step into a future built on love, trust, and devotion. And for years, she played the perfect wife, smiling in wedding photos, whispering sweet words at candlelit dinners, waking up beside a man who adored her. But there are some secrets that refuse to stay buried, some sins that cling to the soul no matter how far you run. It started with a familiar name, one she hadn't heard in years, yet it sent an icy chill down her spine, a voice from the past that belonged in the shadows, not her present life. Then came the messages. At first, innocent, a simple, "How have you been?" followed by, "I miss you," and then a single photo. One image that shattered the illusion she had carefully built. Her hands trembled as she stared at the screen, her heart pounding so loudly she swore it could be heard through the walls. Her husband was asleep in the next room, unaware that his wife's past was clawing its way back into their lives. Because what she saw in that picture, what it reminded her of, was something she had sworn to take to the grave. And now, the grave had been disturbed. 7 years of marriage, 7 years of love, laughter, and quiet Sunday mornings, filled with the scent of fresh coffee and whispered "I love yous." Olivia had built a life most women dreamed of. A devoted husband, a beautiful home, a circle of friends who admired her grace and kindness. To the world, she was radiant, unshaken, a woman who had it all. She and Daniel were inseparable, the kind of couple that made people believe in fairy tales. He adored her in a way that felt rare, his touch always lingering, his gaze filled with the kind of admiration that never faded. Their friends would joke that they were the last true romantics, that their love was untouchable, unbreakable. But love is only as strong as the truth that holds it together. It was on an ordinary afternoon, sunlight spilling through the windows, that Olivia found it, an envelope resting on the doorstep. No name, no return address. Just a simple, unassuming piece of paper. She almost didn't open it. Almost. Her fingers hesitated, her heart beating just a little too fast. Then she slid her nail under the seal, pulling out a single sheet of paper. 3 words. Only 3. Her breath hitched. Her fingers tightened around the letter, crumpling the edges as if she could erase what she had just read. Her knees threatened to give way. The room felt colder, smaller. The air suddenly too thick to breathe. Because someone knew. Someone had reached into the past, dragged it into the present, and placed it right at her feet. And just like that, the life she had built, the love she had nurtured, was standing on the edge of a blade. Olivia's hands trembled as she read the letter again. Each word felt heavier, cutting deeper, pulling her back to a place she had spent years trying to forget. It was impossible. No one knew, no one could have known, but someone did. Her vision blurred, her heart pounding against her ribs. She sank into the nearest chair, the letter still clutched in her shaking fingers. "I know what you did." 3 words, simple, terrifying. Her breath shuddered as memories clawed their way out of the darkness. Memories she had buried so deep, she had convinced herself they were nothing more than nightmares. 17 years old, a house that never felt like home, a mother too distracted by her new husband to notice her daughter's silent screams. And him, her stepbrother. The only person who saw her, who listened, who made her feel like she wasn't invisible. At first it had been innocent, late-night talks in hushed voices, stolen glances across the dinner table, a shared understanding of what it felt like to be unwanted. But then the lines blurred, the boundaries shattered. One night the loneliness became unbearable. One night they crossed a line that could never be undone. She had convinced herself it wasn't wrong, that no one was getting hurt, that they were just 2 broken souls finding comfort in each other, until the shame set in, until she saw the disgust in her own reflection. So she ran. She left, changed her name, erased every trace of who she used to be. And for years it worked. She had built a new life. A perfect life. Until today. Until this letter. Someone knew. Someone wanted to remind her that no matter how far she ran, the past always had a way of catching up. But why now? And who sent it? Olivia barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw those words again, carved into her mind like a fresh wound. I know what you did. Morning light spilled through the curtains, but it did nothing to chase away the dread settling in her chest. She forced herself out of bed, moving like a ghost through the house. She needed to act normal, needed to pretend. But her body betrayed her. Her hands shook as she poured coffee, dark liquid splashing onto the counter. Her heart pounded every time Daniel spoke her name. She avoided his gaze, afraid he'd see the terror lurking beneath the surface. She told herself she could fix this, that if she ignored it, if she erased every trace of herself online, whoever sent that letter would stop. So she deleted everything, Facebook, Instagram, even the email account she hadn't used in years. But the fear didn't leave, and Daniel noticed. He watched her in quiet confusion, his brows knitting together as she dodged his touch. Her smile forced, her laughter hollow. Something was wrong, and he was going to find out what. The first real crack appeared that evening. Olivia stepped outside, the cool air wrapping around her, desperate for a moment to breathe. But as she approached her car, she saw it. Another letter folded neatly, tucked beneath the windshield wiper. Her stomach lurched. She scanned the street, eyes darting between parked cars, empty sidewalks, darkened windows. Someone had been here. Someone had been close enough to touch her car. With trembling fingers, she tore open the envelope. This time, there were more words. You can't run from this. Answer me, or I tell him everything. A choked breath left her lips. The paper slipped from her fingers. No, this wasn't happening. Her pulse roared in her ears as she snatched up the letter, stuffing it into her coat pocket. She rushed inside, locking the door behind her, forcing a smile as Daniel looked up from the couch. But he wasn't fooled. He saw the way her chest rose and fell too quickly, the way she clutched her coat like she was hiding something. And then, later that night, when Olivia left her phone on the table, Daniel did something he had never done before. He picked it up, and what he found made his stomach drop. Olivia couldn't breathe. She sat at the kitchen table, the second letter still clutched in her trembling hands. The words blurred as tears welled in her eyes. You can't run from this. Answer me, or I tell him everything. Her mind raced, sifting through ghosts of the past, trying to make sense of it all. Who could have sent it? Who knew? She had buried that chapter of her life so deep that even she rarely thought about it. She had spent years pretending it never happened, a different time, a different version of herself. But someone had dug it up. Her past wasn't just knocking, it was pounding on the door, demanding to be let in. She needed answers. So she did what she never thought she'd have to do. She started digging, retracing steps she never wanted to walk again. First, she scoured social media, what was left of it after she had deleted nearly everything. Names she hadn't spoken in over a decade flashed across the screen. And then she saw it, his name, her stepbrother, the one person who knew everything. His profile was private, locked away behind a wall she couldn't breach. But then she saw something even more chilling, a woman's name next to his wife. And her profile? It wasn't private. She clicked, scrolled, and then Olivia froze. A recent post, a single line of text. Some secrets refuse to stay buried, some debts must be paid, and beneath it, a blurred-out image. No, it couldn't be. She tapped the photo, her heartbeat hammering as the image sharpened. It was her. A grainy, zoomed-in picture of Olivia at the grocery store just 2 days ago. She wasn't just being threatened. She was being watched. A message popped up in her inbox at that exact moment, as if the sender knew she was looking. Meet me, or he finds out everything. A time, a place, no name. No further instructions. Olivia's breath shuddered out of her lungs. She had no choice. Later that night, she arrived at the meeting spot. A desolate parking lot, rain-slicked pavement gleaming under flickering streetlights. A lone figure stood waiting. As Olivia stepped closer, she finally saw the face of the person who had been pulling the strings, her stepbrother's wife. and she did not look like a woman willing to let the past stay in the past. The house felt different that night, quieter, heavier, like the walls themselves knew what was coming. Olivia sat at the edge of their bed, her fingers gripping the letter so tightly that the paper crumpled beneath them. Her chest ached with the weight of what she had to do. Tell him, or live with this forever. Her phone vibrated beside her, another message. Time's up, tell him, or I will. Her breath hitched. She had spent the last 7 years building a perfect life, one where she was a devoted wife, a loving partner, a woman with nothing to hide. But now, that illusion was crumbling. And Daniel, he didn't deserve to find out from someone else. So she made her choice. She found him downstairs, sitting on the couch, scrolling through his phone. Daniel, I need to tell you something. He glanced up at her, concern flickering in his eyes. Liv? What's wrong? She sat down across from him, her hands trembling. She could already feel the ground slipping from beneath her. There's something from my past, something I never told you. His expression hardened. What are you talking about? She swallowed, the words catching in her throat. When I was younger, I had an affair. His brow furrowed, confusion giving way to something sharper. An affair? Her throat felt like it was closing, but she forced herself to continue. It wasn't just anyone, Daniel. She took a shaky breath. It was my stepbrother. Silence. A deep, suffocating silence that stretched between them like an unbridgeable chasm. Daniel didn't move. He didn't blink, he just stared at her, as if he hadn't really heard her. But then, his phone slipped from his grip, landing on the floor with a dull thud. What did you just say? Her stomach twisted. I never told anyone. I left it behind. I thought it was over. Daniel's breath came in uneven bursts. He stood up, running a hand through his hair. You've been lying to me? His voice was eerily calm. I didn't want to... For 7 years, Olivia? His voice rose, sharp and edged with something she had never heard before. 7 years, and you never thought to tell me? She stood too, reaching for him, but he pulled back as if her touch burned. The look in his eyes, shock, disgust, betrayal, it cut deeper than any blade ever could. His jaw clenched, his hands curled into fists. He turned away, breathing hard, like he was fighting to hold himself together. And then he walked to the door, grabbed his keys, and without another word, he was gone. The sound of the door slamming shut echoed through the empty house. Olivia stood there, frozen, staring at the space where he had been just moments before. Her whole world had just shattered, and she had no idea if she'd ever get it back. The silence was unbearable. Days passed, then weeks. Daniel didn't come home. No messages, no calls, nothing. Olivia was trapped in a limbo of her own making. She would wake up every morning, staring at the empty side of the bed, hoping, praying, that she would hear his keys in the lock, that he would step through the door and tell her this was just a nightmare. But reality had a cruel way of lingering, and then the whispers started. At first it was just a feeling, a strange tension in the grocery store, a lingering stare from a barista who used to smile at her, a conversation that went silent the moment she entered the room. But then the messages began. Disgusting, how could you? We all know your secret now. Someone had spread it. Her past, the one she had buried, locked away, convinced it would never surface again, was now everywhere. Online forums dissected her life like she was a case study in shame. Strangers posted about her, speculating, judging, condemning. Friends she had known for years stopped answering her calls, and she knew exactly who was behind it. Her stepbrother's wife had made good on her threat. She had destroyed Olivia's life. Daniel wasn't handling it much better. He wasn't at work, he wasn't at home, he was nowhere Olivia could find him, but she knew where he would be. Late at night, in a dimly lit bar, with a drink in his hand and a war raging in his mind, he sat at the counter, staring at his reflection in the glass, playing her words over and over again in his head. It was my stepbrother. No matter how many drinks he had, the words wouldn't leave him. This was the woman he had built a life with, the woman he trusted more than anyone. And she had lied to him every single day they were together, but if that was the case, then so had he. The night Daniel returned, Olivia almost didn't recognize him. He looked exhausted, drained, like he had fought a battle and barely made it out alive. She had rehearsed 1,000 things to say to him if he ever came back, but as he stood in the doorway, words failed her. He stepped inside, shutting the door behind him, and then, without looking at her, he said it. "You're not the only one who kept secrets." Her breath caught in her throat. "What are you talking about?" she whispered. Daniel finally met her eyes. "I have a past too, Olivia. And if you knew the truth, you might hate me more than I hated you." The ground shifted beneath her. Everything she thought she knew about him, about their marriage, about the betrayal, was no longer certain. And in that moment, she realized something terrifying. She wasn't the only one hiding something. She wasn't the only one who had lied. And whatever Daniel had kept buried, it was about to change everything. The house was no longer a home. It was just walls and silence. Olivia sat by the window, watching the world move on without her. Cars passed, people laughed, life continued, but she remained frozen in the wreckage of everything she had destroyed. Daniel was gone. Not just physically, he had taken something with him when he left. The trust, the love, the certainty that they were unbreakable. She had broken them, but he had shattered her in return. Because Daniel wasn't innocent, his secret was worse than anything she had ever done. And now she had a choice to make. Daniel wasn't coming back. At least, that's what Olivia kept telling herself. But then, 3 days later, the front door creaked open. She turned, her breath catching in her throat. Daniel stood there, a bag in his hand, his expression unreadable. He didn't look angry. He didn't look sad. He just existed. Like a man who had spent too much time in the dark and no longer knew if he could find the light. Olivia's heartbeat pounded against her ribs. "I had to think," he said, his voice rough. She swallowed. "And?" He let out a slow breath, then placed something on the table, a single, burned corner of a letter. The letter, her entire body went cold. "Who else knew about this?" His voice was quiet, too quiet. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Because she hadn't told him about the fire. She had burned the letters, every single one. But someone had picked up the ashes. The past wasn't done with them. Daniel didn't leave that night. He stayed. But not as a husband trying to mend a broken marriage, not as a man willing to forgive. No, he stayed because something bigger had been set into motion, and walking away wasn't an option anymore. The next morning, Olivia's phone buzzed. A message, unknown number. Some secrets stay buried unless someone decides to dig them up. She gripped the phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her stepbrother's wife had started this, but someone else was finishing it. She looked at Daniel. He was already staring at her. He got the same message, and just like that, the truth became clear. They weren't the only ones keeping secrets. Someone was watching. Someone knew everything. And this was only the beginning.